Why do we keep the days of unleavened bread? So turn to Exodus 13. I read through the Torah a few years ago and was struck by a recurring theme, and that theme is very relevant to unleavened bread. So if you're in Exodus 13, start in verse 3. And Moses said to the people, "Remember this day in which you went out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, for by strength of hand the Lord brought you out of this place. No leavened bread shall be eaten. On this day you are going out in the month Abib, and it shall be, when the Lord brings you into the land of the various Canaanite tribes, which he swore to your fathers to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey, that you shall keep this service in this month. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and on the seventh day there shall be a feast of the Lord. Unleavened bread shall be eaten 7 days, and no leavened bread shall be seen among you, nor shall leaven be seen among you in all your quarters." Verse 8. "And you shall tell your son in that day, saying, This is done because of what the Lord did for me when I came up from Egypt. It shall be as a sign to you on your hand and as a memorial between your eyes, that the Lord's law may be in your mouth. For with a strong hand the Lord has brought you out of Egypt." Now, we've long been taught how the Feast of Unleavened Bread is a spiritual type for the church. Like Israel, God brought us out of Egypt, out from Satan's rule, out of slavery to sin, and we're supposed to put that sin behind and do God's way instead, have his law in our mouths, as it said there. And of course, also like Israel, having left Egypt, we're also on our way to the spiritual promised land, the kingdom. So we know these lessons really well, and we hear them every year, and we do what we're supposed to do. We get the leaven out of our houses, and we focus on getting the leaven out of our lives. But I do have a question. When we keep unleavened bread, how much do we remember? In what we just read, Moses told Israel to remember. Remember that you were in Egypt. Remember that God brought you out miraculously. And pass down what you remember to your children, saying, "We eat unleavened bread because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. I remember that." Also, unleavened bread was to be kept as a memorial of remembrance, so that the Lord's law would be in their mouths. I'll say that another way. Israel was to remember and pass down the things that happened to them, so that the Lord's law would be in their mouths. This is done because of what the Lord did for me when I came up from Egypt. Now, does this admonition to remember what God did for them apply only to physical Israel and the physical events of the Exodus? Or does it also apply to God's church and to us? Well, I think it applies to the church and to us. And I don't just mean that we're to remember the story of physical Israel and the Exodus, though we're certainly to do that. And I don't even just mean that we're to remember Christ's death for us, though we're certainly to do that, and we're going to. But I think there's an important principle here that applies to us ourselves and our own history with God, as the church, the Israel of God, and as congregations, and as individuals. During unleavened bread, we should remember the things that God's done for us and how he did them, our history with God as his people, and recount them so that the Lord's law may be in our mouths. This is done because of what the Lord did for me when I came up from Egypt. Now, I want to try to prove this to you, that this is a principle. I mentioned that this principle of remembering and recounting struck me when I've read through the Torah the last few years. The admonition to remember doesn't just apply to Exodus and unleavened bread, though it's especially important now. It's actually a theme of the Torah and of the Bible. It's a principle for building faith and staying faithful to God. And this is especially clear in the book of Deuteronomy. So we won't turn there. I'll read some stuff from it. But Deuteronomy, as you know, is a recounting of the law. And the overarching theme of Deuteronomy, apart from just listing out the law, is actually to remember. All the instruction, all the law in Deuteronomy is framed in terms of Israel's history so that the Lord's law would be in their mouths. In effect, God says over and over and over, he says, remember these things I did for you. Don't forget them, or you'll forget my law and forget me. Remember these mistakes you made. Don't forget them, or you'll forget my law and forget me. Remember these things your eyes have seen. He says that a lot. Don't forget them, or you'll forget my law and forget me. So let me read you some examples. Again, you don't have to turn to them. And I can't read all the context around them, but all these statements are connected to stories from Israel's history, both ancient and recent, from the fathers, the Exodus, the covenant, the battles they won or the battles they lost, and sin and punishment and temptation, all of it. So here we go. Some passages from Deuteronomy to prove the point. Deuteronomy 4:9. Only take heed to yourself and diligently keep yourself, lest you forget the things your eyes have seen, unless they depart from your heart all the days of your life. And teach them to your children and to your grandchildren, especially concerning the day you stood before the Lord your God in Horeb, which refers to their covenant with God. Deuteronomy 6:12. Beware, lest you forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. So not just forget the Lord, but forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Deuteronomy 9:7. Remember, do not forget how you provoked the Lord your God to wrath in the wilderness. So remember your mistakes so you can repeat them. Deuteronomy 8:2. And you shall remember that the Lord your God led you all the way these 40 years in the wilderness to humble you and test you, to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. And then there's some stories about that. And then in verse 6, he says, therefore, because of all the trials and protection in the wilderness that he goes through, you shall keep the commandments of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways and to fear him. So I think it's illustrated through these examples that God told Israel over and over to remember their history. Don't forget these things that happened to you and your people, and therefore keep the commandments of the Lord. This was God's instruction to Israel in Deuteronomy. Now, as I said, I see this as a principle that extends beyond just physical Israel and their history. I think this principle is sound and applies to the church and us. We should remember our history. Remember the things we saw, the things God did for us and how he did them. Remember the battles we won and lost and our mistakes. And remember and recount the various events of our relationship with God. Remember them, recount them, and pass them down. And like I said, this is God's view on the subject. This is how he framed it when he gave the law to Israel in Deuteronomy. Remember, don't forget, or you'll forget my law and forget me. So I've been thinking a lot for years, actually, but especially recently, about how to apply this principle practically. One relevant tradition of the church that I've really come to love, and which I think follows this direction from God to remember, is our tradition of asking each other at the night to be much observed, how did you come into the church? It's only in the last few years that I've understood the connection between that tradition and this admonition from God to remember our history. But through that tradition and hearing stories of members, especially older ones, and how they left Egypt, which usually starts something like, well, I was working down in wherever it was, and one day I turned on the radio. I found that my faith has been strengthened by those stories. It gives me a sense of place, of belonging, of people. Like, these are my people, and this is our history, and this is what God did for us and how he did it. I get a similar feeling when I hear stories about the church in general, about periods in our history, both good and bad. And there's a reason, for example, that speakers often refer to the worldwide split in messages. That's something we shouldn't forget. in my view, talking about that is no different than Moses recounting the people's sin at Baal Peor, or the sin of Dathan and Abiram with Korah, and telling Israel to remember that, so that they didn't repeat the mistakes. Also, growing up, I'm from the Chicago congregation, obviously, but growing up in Chicago, I heard a lot of personal stories or stories about the church from the pulpit that illustrated spiritual principles. That there was this problem, this is what we did, this is what happened, and there was this opportunity, and this is the door that got opened miraculously, and so on. And I can tell you that benefited me a lot. So in reading these scriptures, and in seeing God's strong admonition to remember, and in realizing how much this principle helped me growing up, I've taken to applying it as concretely as I can. As part of my preparation for the holy days, I've been pondering my own history with God and that of my family and the congregation and the church, and I've been writing some of it down. Preparing for Passover, for example, we're supposed to examine ourselves. And of course, we compare where we're at right now to where we're supposed to be, to Christ. But I've also been looking backward and thinking about where I started and noting the positive change as well, in addition to the areas where I need to improve. And this has been faith building and encouraging. This is what the Lord did for me when I came up out of Egypt. And I've been telling my older sons of our family and the church and our history with God. I'll tell them about miracles I've seen in my life, like the time Courtney and I got into a really bad car accident at around 80 miles an hour. It ripped off both ends of the car, and Courtney was pregnant, and we were both fine. We weren't harmed in the slightest. And furthermore, the airbag didn't go off. I still have no idea why it didn't go off. It didn't go off because God saved us. And if it had gone off, Jackie would be dead. And I've told him that story, and how God did that for us. And now that it's spring, just as in Exodus where we read, I've started saying things like, well, Jack, unleavened bread's coming up. Do you know why we keep it? And he'll usually say, because God said to, which is a good answer. But I'll say that, well, because God saved Israel from Egypt. We should remember that. And you know what else he did? He called Grandpa and Nana. And me too. And of course, the spiritual lessons are abstract for such a little boy. But I'll say things like, we eat unleavened bread because God called us and picked us and is teaching us to be good and not naughty. And I'll tell the stories about his grandfather hearing Mr. Armstrong on the radio, or me growing up listening to Mr. Fay. And when he gets older, I'll probably tell him, more about things like the church splitting and the sin in the wilderness. And I've told him about, for another example, my own decision to become baptized. And he says, I want to be baptized. And it's so cute because he has no idea what he's saying. He doesn't understand yet. But I say, when you're older. And I see his reaction, even as a toddler, that as the history gets passed down of our relationship with God as a family and as a church and so on, and the miracles in our lives, he wants to follow in the same path. This is done because of what the Lord did for me when I came out from Egypt. So I think I've made the point that remembering is a principle that applies to us, and especially during unleavened bread. And I have hit on a few of my own examples of how to apply it, and I'm sure you could think of many more. But I do want to end with one final thought on this principle. So turn to Deuteronomy 11 now. We'll finish here. I already mentioned that the book of Deuteronomy embodies this admonition to remember, so that the Lord's law would be in our mouths. But when was the book of Deuteronomy given? It was at the end of their journey in the wilderness. That was when God told them to remember, right before they started their march into the promised land. And with everything happening in the world right now, I'm sure we've wondered once or twice, I know I have, is this it? Is this finally it? Well, nobody knows. But if it is, then I would say this is really an important time to really remember and really focus on what God's done for us and his love for us and the miracles we've seen, and remember our history and recount it and pass it down. And through that, help build the faith we need right now to enter the kingdom. So Deuteronomy 11, starting in verse 1. You shall therefore love the Lord your God and keep his charge, his statutes, his rules, and his commandments always. And consider today, since I am not speaking to your children who have not known or seen it, consider the discipline of the Lord your God, his greatness, his mighty hand, and his outstretched arm, his signs and his deeds that he did in Egypt to Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and to all his land, and what he did to the army of Egypt, to their horses and to their chariots, how he made the waters of the Red Sea flow over them as they pursued after you, and how the Lord had destroyed them to this day, and what he did to you in the wilderness until you came to this place, and what he did to Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, son of Reuben, how the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up, with their households, their tents, and every living thing that followed them in the midst of all Israel. For your eyes have seen all the great work of the Lord that he did. You shall therefore keep the whole commandment that I command you today, that you may be strong and go in and take possession of the land that you were going over to possess, and that you may live long in the land that the Lord swore to your fathers to give to them and their offspring, a land flowing with milk and honey. So remember your history with God for you, your family, your congregation, and the church, the Israel of God.